So, for those of you who don't know Bruce Perens is one of the founders of the open source movement in software and is the creator of the open source definition, the manifesto of open source, and the rules for open source licensing, which are still followed today. He's been a part of a number of efforts to replace closed systems with open and publicly disclosed ones. His work contributed to the creation of the modern Linux distribution, the modern embedded Linux distribution, and he's more recently been an evangelist of open digital voice codecs and digital modems for amateur radio, inspiring David Rowe to work on Codec 2, the open source low bandwidth digital voice codec, which has now also caused the creation of a number of open data modems. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Bruce.
Hi there. So I was first licensed as a ham in 1974, back when most of you were two cells that had not yet met. And so I've been into this as an amateur since that time. I was a communication arts major, and the reason for that is back when I got to college, computers were used for sending bills, and you could learn data processing, or actually you could be one of a couple dozen people who went to places like MIT, but I wasn't getting in, and communication arts turned out to be really useful. Please interrupt, by the way. You can wave your hands, you can yell it out. I'd rather have a feisty, argumentative audience than a one that's all asleep. And so I'm co-founder of the open source movement in software. And what that means is that Richard Stallman had free software. And we created something called open source because free software wasn't getting into the heads of people in business. And turned out to be really successful. Also founded another organization called No Code International. So if you are a radio ham and you happen to have become one recently enough that you did not have to take a code test, that is because of work that friends of mine and I did. Creator of BusyBox. BusyBox is everywhere. BusyBox is in your phone, your wireless access point. I just actually helped DJI drones come into compliance with the GPL because they had BusyBox in the drone. And that's what we do. We help them come into compliance. We don't actually sue people unless they're really buttheads. And I was a second Debian project leader. And the interesting thing about that was Debian being one of the very early Linux distributions. If you have Ubuntu, it's derived from Debian. So is Mint. And at the time that I came onto the project, Ian Murdoch was project leader, and Ian was making all of what was called the base system, which is all of the kernel and the fundamental utilities. And at that time, base systems of operating systems had always come from one entity, whatever operating system it was. And not knowing any better, I split all of the base system out to multiple package developers. And we had, when I started, about 60 Debian developers, and at the end of this work, about 200. And I had actually met one. And so we had all these people literally all over the world making pieces of an operating system that somehow miraculously actually worked when you put them all together. No one understood at the time that that would work. I participated in the creation of 3D computer graphics feature films. So that was 19 years, 12 of them at Pixar. I have credits on Toy Story 2 and A Bug's Life. If you have slow-mo, you can see them. And series editor, Bruce Perens, open source series, 24 books with Prentice Hall, PTR publishers, none of which I wrote. I was the the person who helped get the authors and decide on what we were doing. And I actually get royalties for the use of my name. Isn't that weird for an open source evangelist? And so that was fun, and they had an open publication license before Creative Commons existed. They were the first book series to have that. And today I have 2 companies. Please use them. LegalEngineering.com assists law firms and their customers with open source and other intellectual property and technical issues. So if your company has screwed up with intellectual property, I will unscrew you. And the way that works is that lawyers understand intellectual property and programmers understand how to code, but neither side understands each other. And so I sort of get in between them and show the programmers how to solve legal problems through engineering, which you actually can do. And so the 2 things this company does is we will keep you from getting in trouble with your intellectual property, not just open source. Everywhere I go, they have 30 third-party commercial software contracts, and they're in violation of 20, and they don't even know it. But we'll help you understand that and give you a compliance program. And so I work on that, and you know, I can bill like a lawyer, so then I spend the other 3/4 of the month working on what I feel like. And Algoram is so far unsuccessful in making SDR mobile transceivers and eventually HTs. The first design was too noisy. We took a break. We'll try again. And I'm working on an undisclosed startup doing the VC thing again this year. I guess most of you don't follow this, but I just got a paper in the Berkeley Technology Law Journal, which is really cool because I'm just a hacker, and presented it at Bolt Hall, which is Berkeley Law, and my co-author is a professor there. And it's on open cars. Will you continue to have the right to open up the hood in your car? You really don't for a lot of things today. It's interesting what comes up. And the most interesting one is with John Deere. So John Deere makes very expensive farming machines, not just tractors, but combines and things that pick your crop, etc. And if you replace certain parts in your John Deere tractor, they have DRM. And after that point, every 10 minutes, an alarm will go off in the cab of your tractor, and you have to reset it until you go to the John Deere dealer and have them authorize your unauthorized part, which may cost a lot of money to do. And so there's this whole issue that we're starting to work on right to repair. Like, if you crack the front of your phone, do you have a right to get the part and fix it by yourself? And that, I think, is important to everyone because increasingly everything you buy is computerized, and you do not own these things. You may own the hardware, and you license the software. Okay, so you don't have full rights to do everything that you want to do. And that's becoming a really big problem because you are a prisoner of the people who make your equipment. And that's a really good reason also to be involved in open source. So consider what would happen, and it actually did, if we had the Beltway Bandit version of GNU Radio. So if you go to Washington, D.C., you drive on the Beltway, it's a highway there, and there are all these buildings with 3-letter acronyms. Okay, so TRW and TYM, that's take your money. And you have them making all of this stuff which they call government support systems. Okay, and there was actually a government support systems predecessor of GNU Radio. And this is really cool because I asked Bob McGuire about it. And, there are a lot of things that Bob could tell you, but he'd have to kill you afterwards. And this wasn't one of them, at least not yet. And so it cost $60 billion. Never actually worked to the customer satisfaction. Predecessor of GNU Radio. No longer maintainable. The developers went elsewhere. Okay, so nobody back then would have ever believed that we could do this stuff in open source. And this was opening that which is closed. So what is it? Making things open source that are only available from proprietary vendors today, and where everyone tells you this is really big magic and you just don't have the stuff to do it. And people just don't believe that open source can act successfully in that field. And historically, we've been really successful at doing this kind of thing. The biggest hurdle that we still have is making systems that users, normal people, not us, really like. Okay, go in the Apple Store and do this. I mean, this is homework. Okay, first of all, dress as a normal person. Okay, second, go stand politely in the Apple Store and watch what is happening. Okay, everyone is excited and happy, and the Apple stuff is empowering them. And this is really cool. They know how to use it, etc. It solves the needs of the person who is not a really weird hacker dweeb like us. And, just go and look at that and think about, well, what is open source getting wrong that Apple does? I think we can still get over that. So Steve Jobs, I worked for Steve for 12 years at Pixar, and my office for a long time was actually across from the executive offices at Pixar, right across the hall. Not because I was anyone important. I think they wanted to keep an eye on me. And so Steve, the nice thing about Steve was you could walk into his office, at least if you were me. I think most people were afraid to walk into Steve's office. And so I walked in because I was leaving. And Steve knew that I was going to work on open source software after I left Pixar. And I said, so Steve, you still don't believe in this open source stuff? And Steve, with this ego halo around him, says, well, I had a lot to do with two of the world's three great operating systems, by which he meant Mac OS and NextStep. And where the other was, I guess, Windows. And Steve says, and every time it took $1 billion lab to make the GUI. So I just don't think you can do it. And 2 years later, Steve stood on a stage at Macworld and announced the Safari web browser, which was based on the KDE rendering engine from the KDE open source GUI. So I won that argument, and Steve, being Steve, never spoke to me after I left Pixar. He had other things to do. So unfortunately, never got to hear from Steve that I won the argument. So anyway, we've made lots of stuff. And what interests me most is when we really make rocket science. So one of the things that people said we just couldn't do was echo cancellation. Echo cancellation was supposed to be rocket science. And David Rowe, who I later got to work with on Codec 2, came along and decided to make an echo canceller in open source. and did a lot of modeling and a lot of study on, well, what do you actually have to do? And found out what we invariably find out in all of these kinds of situations, which is, number one, it is not magic. Okay, all of these things are relatively easily modelable in mathematics, and once you get to that point, you can make the software. Number two, it is a problem which you can decompose. Okay, so that none of the parts are really quite so hard as they might seem. So if you look on his blog, he actually has something more about writing an open source line echo canceller. If you use Asterisk or any of the open source PBXs, it's in there. And I have a feeling it's in all commercial products too. So how can you achieve really cool things? Okay, so there are personal hurdles which you should get by. First of all, you're not qualified, okay? I am fundamentally not qualified to even be in front of you guys, okay? You're not qualified to do what you dream of. You may never be. And sometimes brains count. You know, sometimes you have to be smart, but much more often it's chutzpah. So that is ignoring that you're not at all qualified. Don't have a chance in hell of getting something done. And the point here is I've done all these interesting things, and I am not smarter than you. What I'm talking about today doesn't take genius. I've been tested, and the test has shown conclusively that I am not one. And so I'm innumerate by the standards of this crowd. That means I'm bad at math and have no college degree. So how did that happen? I had the chance to get into film, and every communication arts major knows that 1 in 20 of us will ever have a job offer. So it sort of was a choice of you can go to college or you can have a career. And I'm a survivor of a motor speech and coordination handicap. It took about a decade to learn to speak clearly, and sometimes I still walk on my toes, and I have ADHD, so I can't focus on things like homework. And logically, I shouldn't belong on the same program with Phil Karn, Michelle Thompson, Bob McGuire, and you, but that does not mean the talk's over and it's time for lunch. So it starts for me with anger. I have really strong opinions about a lot of things, so strong that it really can keep me up at night. And a lot of them wouldn't matter to most people, at least at the start. So I really didn't like, from before I became a ham in 74 until sometime in the 2000s, that there was still a Morse code examination for radio amateurs, and you had to learn really well how to tap like one of those telegraphy operators in that Lincoln film. Okay, that was 1850. They were using the American Morse code instead of the international one, but that was the only difference. And it seemed to me that people should get their ham radio license because they wanted to work on modern things, not preserve history. So I was angry about that. And the other thing was Steve telling me to my face, this is before he went back to he went to Next, and then Next folded, and he spent a lot of time in his office at Pixar, and then eventually after that he went to Apple. But while he was at Pixar, he made his peace with Bill Gates, and I could actually see Steve's desk from mine. And one day, the Next workstation was gone, and he put a Windows laptop on his desk at Pixar. And he told us at the time that our imaging system that we built would eventually be hosted on Windows, and I didn't like that. And I started to work on this open source software in Linux, and this is in 1989, 90, before it was really anything that anyone cared about. And so an interesting thing about Linux at Pixar is I was working on my stuff at Pixar, and I got an email from a guy at University of Colorado. And he wrote me and he said, I can't get Debian to work with a serial console. Can you help? And, you know, being a person with ADHD, I really should have continued to work on my stuff at Pixar, but I brought down my system, made the serial console work, documented how to do it, backed that back out, brought up my system, and sent him an email because I wasn't really all that focused an employee. And sent him this, and half an hour later, an email comes back and says, this works great, it's going on the next space shuttle flight. So I walked all around Pixar looking for the one guy who knew what Linux was so I could tell him this. I was Lauren Carpenter. And so Lauren was at home that day. And so I kind of at that point realized that Pixar was maybe not a good fit for what I was doing with my life. But anyway, it starts with being angry about things. And then the other one that really got me was a fundamental part of ham radio was that you could build and understand every part of it. Okay, you could make a transmitter, you could make a receiver, you knew what the modulation was, etc. So I didn't like that amateur digital voice was being taken over by commercial products with locked down codecs. Okay, so there you could talk into it and bits came out and there was obviously magic that you could not conceive of in making those bits, which had to remain proprietary because we were paying for the work of the scientists. So for me, writing was how I dealt with anger. If I wrote about something I didn't like and I published the article, I would feel more in control of the issue and then I could go to sleep. So this often meant that the writing would happen between midnight and 3 a.m. And unfortunately, nobody wanted me early in the morning. And it generally turned out that a lot of people felt the same way that I did about things. And people would write to me. I wanted to explain this to a friend. And I didn't actually know how. I didn't have the words, and you gave me the words. So once I wrote about something, I'd be able to influence people's opinions, and people would get together on an issue who didn't even know that anyone else felt this way. And so that was really cool. But not everyone, not every person in the audience can do persuasive writing well or be a public speaker. Some of us are better at making hardware or software, technical documentation. That's just as useful. You can work out situations that you don't like sometimes. I mean, it doesn't help with your marriage, but with the things that I really care about, so, no, my wife and I are really cool. Don't worry. So these are some of the things I worked on that I'm talking about. There were lots of people working on them with me. I don't mean to take all the credit. And what I did was to influence people and get a bunch of them to work on the same thing. So creation of open source was interesting. Obviously, Richard Stallman came first. And I was at the United Nations Summit on the Information Society with Richard speaking. And I made the mistake of saying that open source stands on the shoulders of Richard Stallman and free software. And Richard goes like this. And so there were problems with the perception of free. People thought that free software meant you had to give all your work away. And Richard's presentation depended on an a priori acceptance of the value of software freedom, and still does today. And yes, software freedom is important, but getting people to accept that before they start is actually kind of hard. So we decided to promote open source as something that business could understand a little better, and it was my personal hope that they would come to understand Richard Stallman's presentation of free software through this. So I had written for Debian an open source guide, essentially called the Debian, well, it was a Debian manifesto, essentially, Debian free software guidelines. And this was republished as the open source definition. And essentially had 10 rules that said an open source license can't do this, can't do this. And the world was strangely ready for this open source thing once we started to talk to people about it. Because if you go back to the time, I think people were very frustrated with the state of software, especially Microsoft Windows at the time. Actually did really suck. And, you know, people would joke about the blue screen of death and all that stuff. And so, you know, here I was, a guy in a cube at Pixar who had written and published this manifesto. And literally months afterward, a member of the press asked Craig Mundy, who was then the vice president of Microsoft, if Microsoft would be open sourcing Windows. And Mundy explained quite coherently what open source was and why it didn't work for Microsoft. And I realized that the vice president of Microsoft had read my manifesto and was explaining it to the press. So, you know, it wasn't that I did anything really special. It was that there was this really big vacuum waiting for this to happen that really sucked it in once it did. So no code was another one where there was this obvious vacuum waiting for somebody to pop a bubble. You know, okay, I'm mixing metaphors. But for the lowest, every grade of amateur radio license, but the very lowest one, there was a requirement that you learn the Morse code. And so these very lowest licenses were really only for short range. They were one step up from CB radios. And what people really wanted was these higher level licenses that would use amplifiers hot enough to cook on and actually could, you know, have global range through ionosphere bounce. And so what had happened was, in the past of amateur radio, people got afraid that there would be too many hams. And the hams themselves actually got FCC to implement a Morse code requirement. And they set the speed just high enough that you could not hear a character in Morse code and think, well, that's a dot and that's a dash and that's A. You had to learn it as a sound, okay? It was coming by too fast for you to actually do the logic in your brain. So you had to learn all of the letters and a bunch of other things as sounds. And you had to learn how to write them down after that. So the test, I believe, at that time was at 13 words per minute, except for the very highest one, which was 20 words per minute. And I felt this deterred people who would be good hams and were interested in, you know, doing new things. So you don't get all of those frequencies to operate a private club. If you are a ham, I want you to internalize this knowledge. Okay, amateur radio must operate in the public interest. Its purpose is spelled out in United States federal law. And I felt that ham radio should have the primary purpose of being a tool for learning and experimentation, which if you read the law, it is still not. And there are things you can learn on ham radio that nothing else allows you, because you own the physical layer. Okay, you are not a client of someone else's network when you're on amateur radio. So amateur radio today fails at most of its own missions, and these are in 97.1 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Okay, so we have an emergency services mission, and yeah, there are hams out helping with the hurricanes right now, but the United States has something called FirstNet that they're building that will not be immediately successful, but just shows, as a number of other things have, that the emergency services role of amateur radio is declining, and actually it will be more important to have trained operators than people with radios in the future. And if you look at, the Cajun Navy right now is rescuing people in private boats, and they're all using a walkie-talkie app. Okay, they're depending on a cellular network that fortunately is still working, but ham radio is being eclipsed in its public service mission. And there is a military mission, it's still in the law, of having a pool of pre-trained radio operators, and that is dead. Amateur radio hasn't been a driver of radio innovation for about half a century, and actually I'm very proud that I've been working on a few projects that are actually turning that around. Doing good codecs and modems is one of them, and our group does that, and Joe Taylor does that, and precious few other people. International friendship is still a good mission. It used to be that heads of state were hams. I wish that the guy in North Korea was, except that he might jam people. But education must be the main mission of amateur radio in the future. So there were about 100,000 hams in the US at the time that they used the code test to limit the number of hams. And at the time it might have made sense because there wasn't an internet. So because FCC did this, and that hams asked for it, they had an international organization. Eventually, we got a Morse code regulation in the International Telecommunications Treaty of ITU, and organization of the UN. So here, to get rid of the code requirement, I had to both change US law and change the treaty. And the FCC was very adamant that they would not fully change their law until the treaty changed. So at the start, being a ham who was for ending the code requirement was very unpopular with other hams. I did presentations at amateur radio conferences. I expected to be punched out or spat upon, and I was only cursed out and shouted at. And you know what? The people who cursed me out have mostly come up and said, well, you won that argument. So hams are fundamentally nice people, even if they can be extremely irascible when they are sure they're right about something. It turned out that there were a lot of people in the closet who shared my opinion, and they could come out if there was a credible speaker for the cause. And that Pixar.com address on my email really did help back then. I presented internationally. I got invited to speak about open source in Iceland. And while I was in Iceland, I asked the ham group in Iceland to host a speech with me, and they were very glad to. And the interesting thing about that was I had about 150 hams in the room, and they were half of the licensed radio amateurs in the country. And they had a vote in the International Ham Radio Association that was equal to the entire U.S. And sometimes these things happen. That's why the Electoral College is a problem. So others on the board and the membership of No Code International presented to FCC local groups in their own nation. And the American Radio Relay League, which I am a big contributor to, I give them right now $1,000 every year. they're the organization of US hams. They fought to the last to preserve the code requirement, and that's mostly because their membership wanted that. And the thing about ARRL, they're really the only organization that we have that protects ham radio, and they're really the only one in the world. You know, there are a couple other big ham radio societies. There's one in Great Britain that can actually get stuff done, etc. There's one in Germany. But ARRL actually runs the international organization as well as the national one. And so they have to have money to protect ham radio, and to have money, their membership has to approve of them. So they can't do anything for the future of amateur radio because their membership is, for the most part, aged and irascible. And for that reason, there has to be an outsider like me who works on the future of amateur radio. And so I've sort of become the loyal opposition of ARRL. They actually, you know, let me speak on their stages and stuff because I think the staff understands what the issues are. So we won. We won this whole no-code thing. Eventually, International Ham Organization, IARU, voted to remove the treaty requirement. They asked the ITU to do so. ITU only meets on this every 10 years. Okay, so there was a little delay there. And through continued campaigning, we were eventually available to get FCC to follow. And most other nations, I think Russia still has a code requirement. And gee, maybe their army still uses Morse, I don't know. So this is the way that amateur radio licensing was trending. And we looked at this down curve, and we saw in that down curve the fact that amateur radio would end in our lifetime, and we would preside over the end of amateur radio. And we really didn't like that. And then, as you can see, in 2007, the Morse code requirement was removed, and we got this up curve. Okay, so there are, last month, I believe, more radio amateurs than there have ever been in the United States. And I think that that is leveling off at about 750,000. We're not sure it will level off, but that appears to be what's happening now. And, you know, then there's the next challenge. So did we save ham radio? We think so. So let's talk about codec 2. So the Japanese Amateur Radio League designed the first practical VHF, UHF digital voice system for ham radio, and they had funding from the Japanese government. They released it in 2001. And they did it very differently than it would be done today because they didn't believe in the capabilities of open source if they'd even heard of it at all. So D-Star is the so far dominant digital amateur radio mode on VHF and UHF. There are these other things called DMR and System Fusion. It's a proprietary product of Digital Voice Systems Incorporated. The codec is sold as a chip. It's a pre-programmed DSP chip. It generally also has the modem in it. It runs at 4,800 bits per second. It reserves another 4,800 bits for a digital channel that is generally not used. But whenever you transmit, it takes up the space anyway. And it's patented. And the protocol of D-Star, but not the codec itself, is published as an open standard. And DBSI actually published a specification of their codec in order to be accepted as a component of APCO Project 25. That's the radios that cops and firemen use. And the spec is deliberately obfuscated. So, for example, it's implemented as a large discrete FFT, which is not how anyone would really do it. And it's a paper spec with no reference implementation. So as it happened, there was one person who implemented it in open source. He still does not reveal his name because he's not interested in having DBSI sue him. And he stopped working on the project because he BSD licensed it. And then it was brought into a number of proprietary products, and he complained on the user list of the proprietary products, and the users of his own software flamed him quite mercilessly for complaining. So he does not develop that software anymore. And this actually also is a lesson about BSD licensing, is like, yeah, it seems like it lets more people do things, but sometimes it really blows up in your face. So that guy is not working on that anymore, and we'd like to see another person working on an AMBI codec, but mostly we're not working on AMBI because we now have a better codec. We believe that the implementation of AMBI originally specified for D-Star AMBI 1000 is out of patent, or the patents that are still in force can't be enforced because of previous disclosures. So it's safe to implement it as it's used in D-Star. But I wanted an open system, and for some things, you really do need a rocket scientist, but fortunately you can find them. So Jean-Marc Vallon, the author of Speaks, introduced me to David Rowe, who'd worked on that line echo canceller. And it turned out David had a PhD in digital voice coding. And I did not know at that point that there actually were PhDs in digital voice coding. I still don't know if there's more than one. And he had published a codec as part of his 1997 thesis, and this became the basis of Codec 2. So don't let this happen to your thesis. Having designed a digital voice codec that was probably revolutionary in 1997, but might have been too slow for the embedded computers at the time, David's thesis sat on the shelf for 15 years. And his work was cited in patents by the makers of proprietary codecs. But a thesis with good work in existing software sat in public view for all that time without a user other than those proprietary companies. And this is what we do with our best and brightest, who, in general, having completed their thesis, go into industry and do something else that maybe they can or can't talk about. And so the moral here is issue open source software with your thesis and make sure that everybody whom you are a thesis advisor to who actually writes software does this. So today Codec 2 provides a range of open source codecs from 3 kilobits per second all the way down to 700 bits per second. And 700 bit per second one isn't terribly clear yet, but you can type fast enough to feed it. And obviously, you're typing octal garbage, etc. And then modems have been developed to work with it. And one goal that's been driving development is SSB transceivers are, of course, baseband SDR radios, if you connect a computer to them. So we could connect a computer to an SSB transceiver and put any narrowband modem on the air. And so Codec 2 first showed up on HF, even though the original idea was for it to be a modem for VHF and UHF. And at that point, we thought, well, gee, can we get better than SSB? That's really hard, it turns out. But we're starting to see the signs that we could actually have a digital voice modem for HF that has better distant performance when you have an extreme connection than single sideband. Commercial ham and two-way radio, digital voice, all implementations all stink. Okay, D-Star, DMR, Yasu System Fusion. D-Star and DMR stink equally. Yasu System Fusion stinks more because they actually had the knowledge out there to do a better system when they made it, and they did not use that knowledge. I really reamed them out because what happened was Yasu never attended the Tapper Digital Amateur Radio Conference before they presented System Fusion to us as a fait accompli, while we had, during a decade before this, been presenting papers on better codecs and modems. So all of these things are built to work on top of analog FM modulators and analog radio platforms that have linearity and equalization issues. So System Fusion is very interesting. It uses 4-symbol FSK, which they call C4FM, with tones that aren't orthogonal. And an optimal FSK modem, which we DSP people know how to make, and it's not really rocket science, implemented using an SDR transceiver can achieve at least an 8 dB improvement over all of these implementations, D-Star, DMR, Yasu System Fusion. So in power terms, a 1-watt radio would perform as well as a 6.3-watt one. And of course, you can use those 8 or 10 decibels in a lot of ways. You can make smaller radios. You can make your batteries last longer. You can have fading margin for when mobiles drive into radio holes, etc. So what's the next step? We have the modems. We have the codec. We don't have mobile base and walkie-talkie radios to run it. And they must be programmable SDR transceivers. They really should, because we're grown up now and we have smartphones and we know that there are better ways to do things. They really should run apps, either on the radio platform or on a connected phone. And they should be built with the assumption that they will not run the same codecs, modems, and apps over their entire useful lifetime. So if you buy a walkie-talkie today, it does one thing, essentially, and it does that thing for its whole life. Okay, we're SDR guys. We don't work that way. So the next step really is making a radio. So Chris Testa and I tried to make one. It didn't work. While we were making it not work, the hardware essentially became obsolete. This is how things work. And so we made mistakes. We spent a lot of time making a computer. And by the time we were done, we could buy faster, better computers already built for less. Our computer had a Smart Fusion flash-based gate array on it, and the CPU was in that same chip. So that's why we made a computer, but that was a silly mistake. Our radio design, it turned out, was too noisy. We spent too long working on gate array code also because the computer wasn't fast enough. And you know, even if you do things like we had a Python system for making gate array code, it still takes 10 times longer than just writing von Neumann software. And we got to the radio design last, which was totally backwards. Having built it, we tested it once the computer was working, and it was too noisy, and that really killed the design. So we're going to do another. Why not use the Raspberry Pi 3? Well, it's I/O limited. And so you need another computer that has larger I/O buses that you can really use. Now, the Pi actually has those buses, but they're not documented, and they depend on undocumented coprocessors. But there are more expensive boards with USB 3, et cetera, which we can actually use. So we took a 2-year break to work on other things, and during that time, nobody has made what we want, so I'm kind of afraid I have to get back into this. It would use an existing computer, existing SDR board, and only require the production of hardware for filters, amplifiers, and glue. And I have all the development hardware on hand. While this was happening, I became really good at buying surplus equipment. I have a wall of Rode and Schwartz spectrum analyzers. And the way this works is Moto was going out of business, and they sold them by the pallet. And you could get a pallet of about 10 Roden Schwartz spectrum analyzers for maybe $8,000. And you could pick out the 2 that immediately worked, and the others could be made to work for a little more effort. There are really bad things about test equipment that I could do a whole paper upon. Like if you want to replace the battery in a Roden Schwartz FSA or FSB, it is a 1.5-hour service to actually get to the battery, during which you break every calibration seal in the unit and you unplug cables between boards to reach it. And they do this stuff deliberately. Expensive test equipment has planned obsolescence built into it. So we had a question. I'm finishing up right away. How can I make money by doing open source? If you have to answer that question, you're probably the wrong person to lead the project. Most successful open source projects are operated by people who need the software to do their work, but they make money in some other way. And most of the income is serendipitous. So imagine Eric Blossom, going out to make a new radio. Never expected Bob McGuire to come along with money from the US government. And I never expected that BusyBox would get me started in working with law. And the key seems to be developing an open source project and a personal capability, and the project actually advertises your capability, and then people with money who want something sort of come along. Marketing has no crystal ball. Marketing departments can't chart the future of a company. If they could do that, they'd be at home investing in stocks. And customers can't tell you what they'll need in the future. They don't know what it is. Customer-driven companies can't lead because of that. So we have the strategic marketing paradigm of open source. Okay, that is a massively parallel drunkard's walk filtered by a Darwinistic process. What the hell does that mean? Okay, what that means is that everybody does what they feel like, without any coordination with each other, and they put it up on the internet and they say, hello world, this is what I've done, please join me. And most of the projects die on the vine at that point, and some of them are adopted by outsiders who make them into viable projects with multiple people on them. And so this, it turns out, works as well as strategic marketing at big corporations, and all that is wasted is the initial efforts of some number of people who've probably learned something useful in making those projects anyway. So I'm going to finish with my lawsuit. You may have heard I'm being sued by a company called GRCon17 Incorporated for publishing an opinion about their GPL compliance and that of their customers. And without discussing the specifics of my own case, because that's stupid to do while you're in a lawsuit, I'm concerned about your freedom to publish and discuss opinions about the GPL and any entity's compliance with the GPL, especially when it concerns your own software or that of a group that you support. Silencing such speech would deter understanding of the GPL as well as enforcement. And we are sort of at a point where there are a lot of entities that are working to deter GPL enforcement in our own industry. And for reasons that could be a whole nother talk, we have to fight that. The GPL works much better than not having it, and it only works if the threat of enforcement is there but rarely used, only used when you're forced to do so. And although it's not here yet, my lawyer works for $1,000 an hour, a lot more than me, and she works full-time, which I don't. And the day could come that I ask for help in pursuing this lawsuit. It is not here yet because of the kind efforts of actually my lawyer, among other things, but it could be there. So with that, thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to being in another talk, and no, it's too late now because I have to let the other speaker go. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. So we had no interruptions from the not so feisty audience. Are you? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and so the next speaker is Tim, I believe, or Shay. Oh, there you go. So maybe we have a question while laptops are getting set up.
Yeah, I want to comment that I want to explain to everyone how the federal government works. You work for a federally funded you work for a federally funded research and development corporation, and you talk a government employee into doing the actual spending of the money. Charles Clancy is actually the person who put Eric Blossom on contract. Cool.
We have time for another question or comment. Thanks. Tom Rundo? Actually, I'll just take mine.
So, Bruce, some good stuff, but I wanted to challenge the idea that ham radio gives you access to the full file layer. The ARRL and organizations like that control that file layer, and they hoard it pretty strictly, and if you try to do anything that they don't like, you get rained down upon with anger and fire from them.
So without going into the incident where this may have happened to you, there are a couple things we really don't like, okay? One of them is encryption, okay? If you have to do encryption, choose part 15 or part 5 or another kind of radio, and I can discuss with you offline why that should be the case. I've also had this discussion with Osman and a lot of people who are working on digital stuff, and maybe new hams are interested in ham. And if there's anything at all that the amateur regulations do not allow you to do, the first step is actually to file for a special temporary authorization. And you can get one of these STAs for almost anything. And I've never actually heard of an occasion where you couldn't get it for amateur radio and you had to get it for part 5 instead. But you could even do that if there was a need to fall back. Now, one of the things I hear is we can't do good spread spectrum radio because it's not authorized, and number two, there are a lot of old guys on HF who are afraid of it happening. However, no one has actually built the radios and gotten an STA, and it is very hard for me to fight for you before you get the radios built, you get that special testing authority, you enroll any number of people, as many as there are radios, and you use them. And this can go on for years. And at that time, you can say, here we have a history. No one's ever complained of interference. And now we're asking for a rule change. That is how it should work. If you want to get anything done at all in amateur radio, you should have the discussion with me offline. And also, there is due October 31st, a comment period on all technical rules in amateur radio. And you actually have an opportunity to say almost anything you want about technical rules of amateur radio and every word of Part 97. And although you might not get what you want immediately, you should take that opportunity if there's something you feel strongly about. Also ask me about that because I know how to file those and have been cited in FCC regulations for stuff that I wrote. Thank you.
So we're having minor technical issues here, so if there's one more question, we could actually throw that in right now. Otherwise, oh, okay, Richard. I'll just walk over with my own mic.
I guess I'm just curious to know, when you started the open source concept, how does it look now compared to what you thought it would be then?
There have been a lot of differences. Revolutions eat their leaders, and I am very happy not to have been eaten so far. However, not all of us have been quite so lucky. I did not, I can't fairly say that I expected all of the industry in involvement. I expected software patents to be a larger problem than they have been, but I feel they are still a problem, and that we need to do work about them, and that the organizations that are purporting to help us with this may actually be there to protect software patenting rather than Linux and open source. I think we still have a lot of trouble getting people to understand the share and share alike part of the GPL and why it is important. And I assert that it is. And people sort of come crying to me once in a while about what happened with their open source, and it's always, I BSD licensed it and people ran away with it. The bottom line for me really is you don't want to make yourself an unpaid employee of a company, and the GPL is a very good vehicle for keeping that from happening. So getting people to understand that stuff has been difficult, but in all, open source has been much, much more successful than I ever expected it to be.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruce Perens. Final round of applause for our keynote speaker. And while Tim